I was 300 feet up a transmission tower in the middle of a Category 3 hurricane when I saw the headlights pulling into my driveway. The wind was screaming past my safety harness at 60 miles per hour, rain hitting my face like needles. But I had a job to do. The main relay had failed, and without it, every first responder, emergency management office, and search and rescue team in a 4-county radius of western North Carolina would be operating blind. So there I was, Todd Ortega, 42 years old, licensed amateur radio operator and volunteer emergency coordinator, doing what I'd done for the past 18 years during every major storm that hit our region. I couldn't think about who was at my house right then. I had to focus on not dying while replacing a critical piece of equipment that weighed 40 pounds and cost more than my first car. The tower swayed in the gusts, and my stomach did that roller coaster thing it always did when the structure moved. You never really get used to it, no matter how many times you climb. 20 minutes later, I had the new relay installed and was making my way down when my phone vibrated in my waterproof pocket. I ignored it. You don't check texts when you're climbing down a tower in hurricane-force winds. That's how people die, and I had no intention of becoming a statistic. The metal rungs were slick with rain, and every movement had to be deliberate and controlled. My boots hit solid ground at exactly 11:47 p.m., according to my watch. The storm was still raging, but the worst of it had passed over. I checked my phone and saw 17 missed calls and about 30 text messages. Most were from other ham radio operators thanking me for getting the repeater back online. 3 were from my wife Sarah, who was safely at her sister's place in Tennessee, away from the storm. But 5 were from a number I recognized with growing dread. Patricia Hendricks, president of the Meadowbrook Hills Homeowners Association. I opened the first message. "Mr. Ortega, we need to speak about your illegal tower immediately." The second, "This is a violation of community standards." The third, "You are in direct violation of Section 7.3 of the HOA bylaws." The fourth, "We are taking action tonight." The fifth, sent just 10 minutes ago, "Tower removal in progress. You will receive an invoice." I stared at that last message, water dripping from my hair into my eyes. Tower removal in progress, during a hurricane. They couldn't possibly be that stupid. I ran to my truck, threw my gear in the back, and drove the 3 miles to my house faster than I probably should have, even in an emergency. The roads were covered in debris, tree branches everywhere, but my truck was built for rough terrain. When I turned onto Maple Ridge Drive, my street in the Meadowbrook Hills subdivision, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a crane in my front yard, an actual construction crane with its arm extended up toward my radio tower. The tower that was currently serving as the primary emergency communications hub for Henderson County, North Carolina. The tower that was, at this very moment, carrying traffic from the National Weather Service, the Henderson County Emergency Management, the local hospital's emergency coordination, and about 40 volunteer emergency communicators. I slammed on my brakes and jumped out of my truck. The crane operator, some guy in his 50s wearing a yellow rain slicker, had the tower's top section in his crane's grip. Standing next to a black Mercedes SUV, protected by a large golf umbrella held by a younger woman, was Patricia Hendricks herself. She was wearing a designer raincoat that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, her blonde hair styled perfectly despite the weather. "What the hell are you doing?" I shouted over the wind. Patricia turned to me with that expression I'd seen too many times at HOA meetings, the one that said she was absolutely certain she was right about everything. "Mr. Ortega, this tower is in violation of our community standards. We've told you repeatedly that it's an eyesore and needs to come down. Since you've refused to comply, we're exercising our right under the HOA bylaws to remove it ourselves and bill you for the cost." In the middle of a hurricane? I gestured at the sky where the storm was still very much happening. "Are you insane?" "The worst of the storm has passed," she said, like she was some kind of meteorologist, "and we needed to act quickly before you tried to claim some sort of emergency exemption." The younger woman holding the umbrella, who I recognized as Patricia's daughter Bethany, nodded along like a bobblehead. I pulled out my phone and showed her the screen, which was currently displaying the emergency net frequency. "Do you see this? This tower is providing emergency communications for this entire region right now. If you take it down, you're cutting off first responders, hospitals, emergency management, everyone. Patricia waved her hand dismissively. That's not possible. Cell phones work just fine. Cell phones are down, I said, trying to keep my voice level. The storm took out 3 cell towers. The landlines are overloaded. This radio system is literally the only thing working right now for emergency communications. I find that hard to believe, Patricia said. Besides, even if that were true, which I doubt, the HOA bylaws are very clear. Section 7.3 prohibits any structure over 15 feet without explicit written approval, which you never obtained. I did obtain approval, I said. Back in 2007, when I first moved here, the HOA board at the time approved it in writing because they understood the community value of having emergency communications infrastructure. That was the old board, Patricia said. This current board has determined that the tower violates our aesthetic standards. We sent you 3 notices to remove it voluntarily. You ignored them. Now we're taking action. The crane operator had paused, looking uncertain. I called up to him. Sir, if you remove that tower, you're interfering with emergency communications during a declared state of emergency. That's a federal crime under FCC regulations. The guy's eyes went wide. He looked at Patricia. She glared at me. Don't listen to him. He's just trying to scare you. We have every legal right to remove this structure. Our HOA attorney has confirmed it. Your HOA attorney doesn't know federal communications law, I said. I pulled out my wallet and showed them my FCC license. I'm a licensed amateur radio operator. I'm also the official emergency coordinator for this district, appointed by the American Radio Relay League and recognized by Henderson County Emergency Management. That tower is currently providing emergency communications under the emergency provisions of Part 97 of the FCC regulations. If you interfere with it, you're breaking federal law. Patricia's expression didn't change. I don't care about your little radio hobby. This is about property values and community standards. The tower comes down tonight. I heard a crackling sound from my handheld radio on my belt. I pulled it up. This is KM4ERC. Go ahead. The voice that came through was stressed and urgent. Todd, this is Marcus at the EOC. We just got word of a multi-vehicle accident on Highway 64 near the airport. We need to coordinate ambulances and fire rescue. Are you back on the repeater? 10-4, Marcus. Repeater is operational and I'm monitoring. Thank God, Marcus said. We lost contact with 2 rescue units in the field. Can you try to raise them on the emergency frequency? Copy that. Working on it now. I switched frequencies and started calling the missing units. While I was doing this, Patricia walked up to me. You need to leave the property so we can complete the removal. I held up one finger, telling her to wait while I finished. One of the rescue units responded. They'd taken shelter from the storm in a barn and lost radio contact temporarily. I relayed their position to the EOC and confirmed they were mobile and heading to the accident scene. Then I turned to Patricia. Did you hear that? That tower you want to tear down just helped locate a missing rescue unit. During a hurricane, people could die without it. You're being dramatic, she said. The emergency services have their own communications equipment, which relies on infrastructure that's currently down, I said. Patricia, I'm asking you, please, wait until tomorrow. Let the storm pass completely. Let the emergency pass. Then we can discuss this through proper channels. Proper channels. She actually laughed. We've been going through proper channels for 6 months. You've fought us at every turn. You've claimed exemptions, filed appeals, hired lawyers. The time for discussion is over. The tower comes down tonight. The crane operator was still looking nervous. I walked over to him. Sir, what's your name? Reggie, he said. Reggie Thompson. Reggie, I need you to understand something. That tower is protected under federal law right now. If you remove it while it's being used for emergency communications, you're personally liable for federal charges. Not the HOA, not Patricia Hendricks, you. Reggie looked at Patricia. Maybe we should wait until tomorrow, madam. What he's saying sounds pretty serious. He's bluffing, Patricia said. And I'm paying you $5,000 for an emergency after hours job. Are you going to do it or not? $5,000. That explained why Reggie was out here in a hurricane. That was probably triple his normal rate. I'm not bluffing, I said. I pulled up a document on my phone, the Federal Emergency Communications Order I'd filed with the FCC at the start of the storm. See this? This is official documentation that this station is operating under emergency authority. I filed it with the FCC at 6 p.m. when the hurricane warning was issued. Federal law specifically prohibits interference with emergency communications. Title 18, Section 1362 of the U.S. Code. It's a felony. Reggie looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. I don't know, madam. I don't want to get involved in federal stuff. Patricia's face was getting red. This is absurd. Fine, I'll pay you $7,000. Madam, it's not about the money at this point, Reggie said. If what he's saying is true, I could lose my operator's license. I could go to jail. It is true, I said, and I'll make sure you understand, Patricia. If you force this man to remove that tower tonight, I will immediately file a complaint with the FCC, the FBI, and the U.S. Attorney's Office. I will provide them with all the documentation showing that you willfully interfered with emergency communications during a declared disaster. The penalties for that can include up to 10 years in federal prison and fines up to $250,000. Patricia stared at me. For the first time, I saw a flicker of uncertainty cross her face. But then she set her jaw. You're lying. You're just trying to protect your precious tower. I called up the frequency on my radio. Attention all stations on the emergency net. This is KM4ERC, the emergency coordinator. Be advised that there is an attempt being made to forcibly remove the W4NC repeater site that is currently serving as our primary communications hub. The attempt is being made by the Meadowbrook Hills Homeowners Association president, Patricia Hendricks. I am documenting this interference with emergency communications for federal authorities. All stations, please log this incident with timestamps. Immediately, my radio started crackling with responses. Emergency management acknowledged. 3 fire departments acknowledged. The hospital emergency coordinator acknowledged. 2 sheriff's deputies acknowledged. The National Weather Service liaison acknowledged. Then a new voice came on. KM4ERC, this is station W4RMJ. Please identify the individual attempting to interfere with the emergency repeater. I recognized that call sign. W4RMJ was Robert Jenkins, the district emergency coordinator for Western North Carolina. He was also a retired federal prosecutor. This is KM4ERC. The individual is Patricia Hendricks, president of the Meadowbrook Hills HOA. She has hired a crane operator to physically remove the tower despite being informed that it's currently in use for emergency communications. Acknowledged, Robert's voice said. Mrs. Hendricks, if you can hear this transmission, be advised that I am also documenting this incident and will be forwarding all information to the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Western District of North Carolina. Interference with emergency communications during a declared disaster is a federal felony. I strongly advise you to cease immediately. Patricia's face had gone from red to pale. This is harassment. You're all ganging up on me because I'm trying to enforce simple community standards. No, I said quietly. We're trying to explain to you that community standards don't override federal law, especially not during an emergency when lives are at stake. My radio crackled again. All stations, this is the Henderson County Emergency Management Director. We are officially requesting that the W4NC repeater remain operational until the emergency declaration is lifted. Any interference with this equipment will be treated as a criminal matter. That was Tom Mitchell, the actual county emergency management director. He didn't get on the radio often, but when he did, people listened. Reggie had already started lowering the crane arm. I'm out. This is way above my pay grade. Sorry, Mrs. Hendricks, but I'm not going to federal prison for $7,000 or any amount of money. You can't just leave, Patricia said, her voice rising. We have a contract. Sue me, Reggie said. He was already climbing down from the crane operator's cabin. I want no part of this. Patricia turned to me, her eyes blazing. This isn't over, not by a long shot. You think you can hide behind some emergency excuse forever? The storm will pass, and when it does, that tower's coming down. Then we'll deal with it through proper legal channels, I said. But not tonight, not during an emergency. She stared at me for a long moment, rain streaming down her face despite the umbrella Bethany was holding. Then she turned and marched to her Mercedes. Bethany scrambled after her, struggling to keep the umbrella over her mother's head. They drove away, leaving Reggie to figure out how to get his crane out of my yard in the middle of a hurricane. I helped him as much as I could, spotting while he maneuvered the big machine back onto the street. It took almost an hour, and by the time he left, we were both exhausted and soaked to the bone. My radio had been busy the whole time with emergency traffic. The accident on Highway 64 had turned out to be serious, 5 vehicles involved, but everyone was going to survive. There were reports of flooding in several low-lying areas. A couple of elderly residents needed evacuation from a neighborhood where trees had blocked all the roads. The volunteer fire department was coordinating with county road crews to clear access routes. All of this communication was happening through my tower. The tower that Patricia Hendricks had tried to tear down. I went inside my house, changed into dry clothes, and set up my radio station in the spare bedroom I used as my ham shack. I would be up all night coordinating emergency communications, but that was fine. That's what I signed up for when I took on the role of emergency coordinator. Around 3 in the morning, Sarah called. She'd been watching the news and heard about how bad the storm had hit our area. I told her I was fine and that the house was undamaged except for some missing shingles. I didn't mention the incident with Patricia and the crane. There would be time for that later. The storm finally passed completely around dawn. The sky turned from black to gray to pale blue, and the wind dropped to nothing. I'd been on the radio for almost 12 hours straight, running on coffee and adrenaline. The damage assessment started coming in as daylight revealed what the storm had done. Henderson County had gotten off relatively lucky compared to some areas, but there were still downed trees everywhere, power lines down, flooding in the usual spots, and a lot of damaged roofs. The cell network was still mostly down. Power wouldn't be restored for days in some areas. And through it all, the amateur radio network kept working, coordinating emergency services, passing health and welfare messages, helping people find missing family members. I finally got a few hours of sleep around 10 in the morning, but my phone woke me up at noon. It was Robert Jenkins, the district emergency coordinator. "Todd, good work last night," he said. "You kept the net running under some pretty difficult circumstances." "Thanks, Robert. Just doing the job. I heard about the incident with your HOA. I wanted you to know I've already filed a formal complaint with the FCC regarding the attempted interference. I've also contacted the U.S. Attorney's Office. They're very interested in the case." I sat up in bed, suddenly wide awake. Is that really necessary? I mean, she backed off. Nothing actually happened. "Something almost happened," Robert said. "Todd, what that woman tried to do last night was incredibly serious. If she'd succeeded in taking down that tower, we would have lost communications in the middle of a major emergency. People could have died. The feds take this stuff very seriously, especially after what happened during Hurricane Katrina when communication breakdowns contributed to the death toll." "I understand, but I still have to live in this neighborhood. I don't want to make enemies," Robert sighed. "I get that. But you need to understand something. This isn't just about you and your HOA. This is about protecting emergency communications infrastructure. If we let HOAs get away with this kind of thing, it sets a precedent. Other amateur radio operators who provide emergency services might get bullied into taking down their antennas. That makes everyone less safe." He had a point. I'd heard stories from other hams about battles with HOAs over antennas. Some had given up and moved. Others had fought expensive legal battles. "So what happens now?" I asked. "The FCC will investigate. The U.S. Attorney will review the case. If they decide to prosecute, Mrs. Hendricks could be looking at federal charges. At a minimum, she'll probably face hefty fines. The HOA itself might also face penalties." "Jesus," I muttered. "It's serious business," Robert said. "Anyway, I wanted to give you a heads up. You'll probably be contacted by investigators in the next few days. Just tell them the truth about what happened." After we hung up, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. This was escalating way beyond what I'd expected. I'd just wanted Patricia to leave my tower alone during the emergency. I hadn't intended to get her charged with federal crimes. But then again, she'd been the one who insisted on removing the tower in the middle of a hurricane. She'd been warned multiple times that it was illegal. She'd chosen to ignore those warnings. I got up and made more coffee. My radio was still on, and I could hear the emergency net winding down as the immediate crisis passed. Regular communications were starting to be restored in some areas. The National Weather Service was saying the danger had passed, though we'd need to watch for potential flooding over the next few days as water drained from the mountains. Around 2 in the afternoon, I got a visit from 2 people I didn't expect: Sheriff's Deputy James Morrison and a woman in a business suit who introduced herself as Federal Agent Linda Cortez from the FBI. "Mr. Ortega," Agent Cortez said as we sat in my living room, "I understand you had an incident last night involving your amateur radio equipment." I told them the whole story. Agent Cortez took notes on a tablet while Deputy Morrison recorded the conversation on a digital recorder. They asked detailed questions about the timeline, about what exactly Patricia had said, about whether I'd documented the emergency traffic that was being carried on the repeater. "I have recordings," I said. "I automatically record all transmissions on the emergency frequency. It's standard procedure during activations." "We'll need copies of those recordings," Agent Cortez said. I provided them with USB drives containing the recordings, as well as printouts of the FCC paperwork I'd filed declaring an emergency activation. "Is Patricia Hendricks going to be arrested?" I asked. Agent Cortez and Deputy Morrison exchanged glances. "That's not a decision I can make right now," Agent Cortez said. "The U.S. Attorney will review all the evidence and make a determination about charges. But I'll be honest with you, Mr. Ortega. What she did was extremely serious. Attempting to disable emergency communications during a declared disaster is one of the most serious charges we can bring against someone. It's treated almost as severely as terrorism because it has the potential to cause mass casualties." That made my stomach clench. I hadn't thought about it in those terms, but she was right. If that tower had gone down, if we'd lost communications at a critical moment, people could have died. After they left, I tried to go about my day normally, but it was hard to focus. The neighborhood was busy with people cleaning up storm damage, cutting up fallen trees, fixing broken fences. A few neighbors stopped by to thank me for the emergency communications the night before. Apparently, word had spread about what I did. Mrs. Chen from 3 houses down brought me homemade soup. "My son is a firefighter," she said. "He told me that the radio network was the only thing working last night. He said you stayed up all night making sure it kept running." "Thank you." That made me feel a little better about everything. Sarah came home that evening. She'd left her sister's place as soon as the roads were clear. When I told her about the incident with Patricia and the crane, her eyes went wide. "She tried to take down the tower during the hurricane," Sarah said. "Is she completely insane?" "Apparently," I said. "And now the FBI is involved?" "Yeah." Sarah sat down heavily on the couch. "Todd, this is going to make living in this neighborhood really awkward." "I know," I said. "But what was I supposed to do? Let her shut down emergency communications?" "Of course not," Sarah said. "You did the right thing. I'm just saying Patricia Hendricks is not someone who takes defeat gracefully. She's going to make your life hell." Sarah knew Patricia better than I did. They'd served on a school fundraising committee together a few years back, and Sarah had come home with stories about Patricia's controlling behavior and her tendency to hold grudges. "Let her try," I said. "Federal law is on my side." "Federal law doesn't protect you from having your car keyed or your trash cans knocked over," Sarah said. "That woman is vindictive." Over the next few days, the neighborhood slowly returned to normal. Power was restored. Cell service came back online. The roads were cleared of debris, but the tension in Meadowbrook Hills was palpable. Patricia had apparently been telling everyone her version of the story, which painted me as a crazy radio fanatic who'd threatened an innocent crane operator with false federal charges. Some of the neighbors seemed to believe her. I started getting dirty looks from people I'd known for years. Then I got the notice. It was hand-delivered by a process server and stated that the Meadowbrook Hills HOA was fining me $15,000 for violations of the community standards regarding unauthorized structures. The notice also informed me that if the tower was not removed within 30 days, the fines would increase to $500 per day. I called my lawyer, Martin Greenberg, who'd been helping me with the HOA situation for the past 6 months. "They can't do this," Martin said after I read him the notice. "Not while there's an active federal investigation, And certainly not after you've proven that the tower's being used for emergency services. So what do? Let me file a response. We'll challenge the fines and cite federal preemption. The FCC has regulations that specifically prohibit HOAs from banning amateur radio antennas used for emergency communications. This is going to be a slam dunk case. But in the meantime, I still had to live in the neighborhood, and Patricia was making sure everyone knew I was, in her words, a troublemaker who thinks federal laws don't apply to him. The irony wasn't lost on me. A week after the storm, I got another visit from Agent Cortez. This time she wasn't alone. She had another FBI agent with her and a representative from the FCC's Enforcement Bureau. "Mr. Ortega," Agent Cortez said, "we've completed our initial investigation. The U.S. Attorney has decided to move forward with federal charges against Patricia Hendricks and the Meadowbrook Hills HOA." My stomach dropped. What kind of charges? Mrs. Hendricks is being charged with attempted interference with emergency communications, which is a felony under Title 47, Section 333 of the U.S. Code. She's also being charged with conspiracy to commit a federal crime. The HOA itself is being charged as a co-conspirator since they authorized and funded the attempted removal. "Jesus," I said. "There's more," Agent Cortez said. "During our investigation, we discovered that Mrs. Hendricks falsified documents to hire the crane operator. She told him she had a court order authorizing the removal of your tower. That's fraud. We've added those charges as well." "What about Reggie, the crane operator?" "He's cooperating with the investigation. He won't face charges since he stopped once he understood the situation." The FCC representative, a serious-looking man named David Kramer, spoke up. "Mr. Ortega, the Commission is also moving forward with its own enforcement action. The HOA will face fines for attempting to interfere with a licensed amateur radio station. Those fines will likely be in the range of $100,000 to $250,000. I felt dizzy. This had spiraled so far beyond what I'd imagined. "The U.S. Attorney wants you to testify before a grand jury," Agent Cortez said. "They're convening next month. Your testimony, combined with the recordings and other evidence, should be sufficient for an indictment." And then what happens? Then there's a trial. Mrs. Hendricks will likely try to plead it down, but given the severity of the charges and the fact that this happened during a declared emergency, the U.S. Attorney isn't inclined to offer much. She's looking at potential prison time. After they left, I sat in my living room feeling like I'd been hit by a truck. I'd never wanted any of this. I just wanted to operate my radio station and help with emergency communications. Now I was going to be responsible for sending my HOA president to federal prison. Sarah found me sitting there an hour later, staring at nothing. I told her what the FBI had said. "Oh my God," she said, "prison." That's what they said. "Todd, she brought this on herself. You warned her multiple times. Other people warned her. She chose to ignore all of it." "I know, but still, prison seems extreme." "She tried to shut down emergency communications during a hurricane," Sarah said firmly. "People could have died. What she did wasn't just stupid, it was dangerous. She deserves whatever happens to her." But it wasn't just Patricia who was going to face consequences. The entire HOA was being charged, which meant every homeowner in Meadowbrook Hills was potentially liable for the fines. That was going to make me extremely unpopular. Sure enough, within days of the charges being announced publicly, I started getting hate mail. Someone spray-painted snitch on my garage door. My trash cans were dumped out in the street. Someone slashed my truck's tires. Deputy Morrison came by to take a report about the vandalism. "This is getting ugly," he said. "Have you thought about getting security cameras?" "I have cameras," I said, "but whoever's doing this knows where they are and avoids them." "I'll increase patrols in your area," he said. "But Todd, between you and me, you might want to think about moving. This neighborhood is toxic for you now." I didn't want to move. Sarah and I had lived here for 17 years. We'd raised our kids here. Our son's height marks were still penciled on the kitchen door frame. Our daughter's tire swing was still hanging from the oak tree in the backyard. But Deputy Morrison was right. The atmosphere in Meadowbrook Hills had become poisonous. People who'd been friendly for years now crossed the street to avoid me. The woman who lived next door, who used to chat with Sarah about gardening, now pretended we didn't exist. 2 weeks after the charges were announced, there was an emergency HOA meeting. I wasn't technically required to attend, but Sarah convinced me to go. "You need to explain to people what really happened," she said. "Patricia has been spreading lies. Someone needs to tell the truth." The meeting was held at the community center, and it was packed. Every seat was taken, and people were standing along the walls. The mood was hostile from the moment I walked in. Patricia was there, sitting at the head table with the other board members. She looked like she'd aged 10 years in 2 weeks. There were dark circles under her eyes, and her usually perfect hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail. When the meeting was called to order, the first item on the agenda was the federal charges and the potential financial liability facing the HOA. Jeremy Blackstone, the HOA treasurer, looked physically ill as he explained the situation. The fines from the FCC could be as high as $250,000. The HOA's insurance won't cover it because it's considered a criminal act. That means the cost will have to be split among all homeowners. We're looking at special assessments of around $3,000 per household. The room erupted. People were shouting, demanding to know how this had happened. Patricia stood up. "This is all because of Todd Ortega and his illegal radio tower. If he had just followed the rules like everyone else, none of this would have happened." I stood up too. "That's not true, and you know it. My tower was legally installed with HOA approval in 2007. You tried to remove it illegally during a hurricane while it was being used for emergency communications. That's why you're facing federal charges. Your tower is an eyesore that violates community standards," Patricia said, her voice shaking. "Community standards don't override federal law," I said. "Multiple people explained that to you. You chose to ignore them." A man I didn't know very well, someone from the new subdivision on the east side, stood up. "I don't care about your tower or the HOA rules. I care about not having to pay $3,000 because Patricia Hendricks decided to play vigilante during a hurricane." That opened the floodgates. More people started speaking up, and most of them were angry at Patricia, not at me. It turned out that once people understood what had actually happened, they realized how reckless she'd been. Someone called for a vote of no confidence in Patricia's leadership. Someone else moved to remove her from the board entirely. The meeting descended into chaos with people shouting over each other. Finally, Martin Greenberg, my lawyer, stood up. He wasn't a resident of Meadowbrook Hills, but he'd come to the meeting to represent me. "Excuse me," he said loudly. "May I address the board?" The room quieted down. "I represent Mr. Ortega in this matter. I want to make something very clear. The federal charges against Mrs. Hendricks and the HOA are not Mr. Ortega's fault. He didn't file charges. The federal government did, because what happened was a violation of federal law. Mr. Ortega actually tried to stop Mrs. Hendricks from committing a crime. She chose to proceed anyway." Martin paused to let that sink in. "Furthermore, I want to inform this board that Mr. Ortega has legal grounds to sue the HOA for harassment, for the illegal fines they have attempted to assess, and for the vandalism he suffered as a result of the HOA's actions. However, Mr. Ortega has no desire to add to the HOA's financial burdens. He just wants to be left alone to maintain his amateur radio station, which, I remind you, provides a valuable service to this community and is protected under federal law." Someone in the audience asked, "So what happens now? Are we all going to have to pay these fines?" Martin shook his head. "That depends on how the legal proceedings go. If Mrs. Hendricks pleads guilty and accepts responsibility, the FCC might be willing to reduce the fines against the HOA. If she fights it and loses, the fines will likely be the maximum allowed. My advice to this board would be to immediately disavow Mrs. Hendricks's actions, cooperate fully with federal authorities, and potentially bring in a mediator to negotiate with the FCC." Patricia looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. Bethany, her daughter who was sitting beside her, was crying. The board voted unanimously to remove Patricia as president and to suspend her from the board pending the outcome of the federal case. They also voted to rescind all fines against me and to officially recognize my amateur radio station as a community asset. It was a hollow victory. I still had to live in a neighborhood where half the people blamed me for their financial problems, and I was still going to have to testify against Patricia in federal court. The grand jury hearing happened 6 weeks after the storm. I spent 3 hours answering questions from Assistant U.S. Attorney Rachel Edmonds and the grand jurors. I explained amateur radio, emergency communications, the federal regulations protecting it, and exactly what had happened that night. The grand jury indicted Patricia Hendricks on all charges. She was arrested the next day and released on $50,000 bond. The local news picked up the story. HOA president faces federal charges for interfering with emergency communications during hurricane. The story went viral on social media, with most people expressing shock that an HOA would do something so reckless. National amateur radio publications covered it too. I got emails from ham radio operators all over the country, thanking me for standing up to an HOA bully. Some of them shared their own horror stories about battles with HOAs over antennas. But locally, I was still persona non grata in my own neighborhood. The vandalism continued. Someone threw eggs at my house. My mailbox was knocked over. Sarah's car was keyed while she was shopping at the grocery store. We seriously discussed moving. We looked at houses in other neighborhoods, other towns even. But Sarah and I are both stubborn people. We didn't want to be driven out of our home by bullies. The trial was scheduled for 4 months after the storm. Patricia's lawyer tried to get the charges dismissed, arguing that she hadn't actually succeeded in removing the tower, so no real harm had been done. The judge rejected that argument, noting that attempted interference with emergency communications was still a crime, and that success wasn't required for prosecution. Patricia's lawyer then tried to argue that she hadn't known her actions were illegal, but the defense fell apart when the prosecution presented recordings of multiple people, including me, explicitly warning her that what she was doing was a federal crime. The trial lasted 3 days. I testified on the first day, walking the jury through the events of that night. I had to explain what amateur radio was, how it worked, why it was important for emergency communications, and exactly what Patricia had said and done. The prosecution played the recordings from that night, including the emergency traffic that had been passing through the repeater while Patricia was trying to have it removed. You could hear people coordinating rescue operations, searching for missing people, calling for ambulances. And you could hear my conversation with Patricia, where I repeatedly warned her that what she was doing was illegal. Reggie Thompson, the crane operator, testified on the second day. He confirmed that Patricia had told him she had legal authority to remove the tower, and that he'd only stopped when he realized federal law was involved. Robert Jenkins, the district emergency coordinator, testified about the importance of the repeater to regional emergency communications and the potential consequences if it had been taken offline. Tom Mitchell, the Henderson County Emergency Management Director, testified that losing that repeater during the storm could have resulted in deaths because emergency services wouldn't have been able to coordinate effectively. Patricia's defense was essentially that she'd been trying to enforce legitimate HOA rules and hadn't understood the federal implications. Her lawyer painted her as a dedicated community volunteer who'd made an honest mistake, but the prosecution demolished that argument by showing all the warnings she'd received and all the opportunities she'd had to back down. They argued that Patricia had been so focused on asserting her authority that she'd recklessly endangered public safety. The jury deliberated for 5 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Patricia's sentencing hearing was 6 weeks later. The prosecution asked for prison time, arguing that the crime was serious and that Patricia had shown no remorse. Patricia's lawyer asked for probation, arguing that she was a first-time offender who'd made a mistake. The judge, a stern-looking woman named Margaret Holloway, seemed unimpressed with both arguments. "Mrs. Hendricks," Judge Holloway said, "you were given multiple opportunities to avoid this situation. You were warned repeatedly that your actions were illegal. You chose to proceed anyway, driven by a misguided sense that your authority as an HOA president somehow superseded federal law. What you did was not just illegal, it was profoundly reckless. During a major hurricane, with emergency services stretched thin and lives at stake, you attempted to disable critical communications infrastructure. The fact that you were unsuccessful doesn't mitigate the seriousness of your actions." Judge Holloway sentenced Patricia to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 2 years of supervised release. She was also fined $75,000 personally, in addition to the $200,000 fine levied against the HOA by the FCC. The courtroom was silent when the sentence was announced. Patricia started crying. Bethany, sitting in the gallery, sobbed openly. I felt sick to my stomach. I'd never imagined it would go this far. But Judge Holloway wasn't finished. I want to be clear about why I'm imposing this sentence. Emergency communications infrastructure is critical to public safety. When disasters strike, people's lives depend on the ability of emergency services to communicate and coordinate. Anyone who interferes with that infrastructure for any reason poses a danger to the entire community. This sentence is meant to send a message that such interference will not be tolerated. After the sentencing, I walked out of the courthouse feeling numb. Martin Greenberg walked with me. "How are you holding up?" he asked. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Part of me feels like justice was served, but part of me feels terrible that Patricia is going to prison because of me." "Not because of you," Martin corrected, "because of her own choices. You gave her every chance to walk away. She chose not to." But it still felt awful. The fallout from the case continued for months. The HOA had to take out a loan to pay the FCC fine, which meant increased HOA dues for everyone. Some residents tried to sue Patricia personally to recover their costs, but her assets were protected by bankruptcy. Meadowbrook Hills effectively became split into two camps, those who blamed me for the whole mess and those who blamed Patricia. The division made every HOA meeting contentious and every neighborhood gathering uncomfortable. Sarah and I eventually decided to move, not because we wanted to, but because we wanted our lives back. We wanted to live somewhere where our neighbors didn't hate us, where we didn't have to worry about vandalism, where we could just be normal people. We found a house in a rural area about 20 miles outside Henderson County on 5 acres with no HOA. I built a new tower, bigger and better than the old one, with no one to tell me I couldn't. Before we moved, though, something unexpected happened. Hurricane season came around again, and a tropical storm was forecast to hit our region. It wasn't as serious as the previous year's hurricane, but it was still going to bring heavy rain and high winds. The new emergency coordinator for Henderson County called me. "Todd, I know you're moving soon, but is your tower still operational?" "Yeah, it's still up and running." "Could you activate it for the storm? We haven't been able to get approval to build a replacement yet, and your station is still the best positioned for coverage." "Of course," I said. So once again, I spent a stormy night coordinating emergency communications from my ham shack. And once again, the amateur radio network kept working while commercial systems struggled. The difference was that this time, several of my Meadowbrook Hills neighbors stopped by during the storm to thank me. Mrs. Chen brought more soup. The Johnsons from 2 streets over brought coffee. Even Jeremy Blackstone, the former HOA treasurer who'd been one of Patricia's allies, stopped by. I owe you an apology," Jeremy said. "I believed Patricia when she said you were the problem. I didn't understand what you were actually doing here. My sister lives in Florida, and during Hurricane Ian, she told me that the only way she could communicate with the outside world was through amateur radio operators. I didn't connect the dots until then. What you do is important. I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." After the storm passed, several neighbors helped me take down the tower and pack up my equipment for the move. It was a bittersweet moment, saying goodbye to the station I'd operated for almost 2 decades. We moved to our new house in October. The tower at the new place was up and running by November. I continued my work as an emergency coordinator, but now I was covering a different district. Patricia served 14 months of her sentence at a federal prison camp in West Virginia before being released on good behavior. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she'd moved to Florida to live with relatives and that she'd cut all ties with Meadowbrook Hills. Bethany, her daughter, actually reached out to me about a year after the trial. She sent me a letter apologizing for her part in the incident. "I was young and stupid," she wrote. "I believed everything my mom told me about you and your tower. I didn't understand what was really happening. I've since done my own research on amateur radio and emergency communications, and I realize now how important what you do is. I'm sorry for my role in that awful night. I hope you can forgive me." I wrote back telling her that there were no hard feelings and that I hoped she and her mother were doing well. The Meadowbrook Hills HOA eventually recovered financially. They paid off the loan for the FCC fine over 5 years with increased dues. They also completely rewrote their bylaws to explicitly allow amateur radio antennas and other emergency communications equipment. The new bylaws actually cite my case as an example of what not to do when dealing with federally protected equipment. As for me, I continued doing what I'd always done. I maintained my station, I trained new amateur radio operators, I coordinated emergency communications when disasters struck. Sarah and I enjoyed our new house and the peace that came with not having an HOA breathing down our necks. Every year on the anniversary of that hurricane night, I get calls and messages from the people who were part of the emergency net that night. We check in with each other, share stories, remember the lives we helped save. Because that's what it was really all about, not towers or HOA rules or federal charges. It was about being ready to help when disaster struck. It was about keeping the lines of communication open when everything else failed. It was about community in the truest sense of the word. Patricia Hendricks had seen my tower as an eyesore that hurt property values. She'd seen it as a symbol of someone breaking HOA rules. She'd been so focused on asserting her authority that she'd lost sight of why the tower existed in the first place. But the people whose lives were touched by emergency communications that night understood. The family who got the message that their missing father was safe. The rescue crew who got directions to the accident scene. The elderly couple who were evacuated from their flooded home because we could coordinate their rescue. They understood that some things are more important than property values and community aesthetics. Some things are worth protecting, even when it makes you unpopular with your neighbors. Looking back on the whole experience, I can't say I'd do anything differently. I gave Patricia every chance to back down, every opportunity to avoid the consequences. She chose her path, and I chose mine. My path led me to a new house, a new tower, and continued service to my community through emergency communications. Patricia's path led her to federal prison and bankruptcy. I take no joy in what happened to her, but I don't feel guilty about it either. She made her choices. She decided that her authority as HOA president was more important than public safety. She decided to ignore federal law and multiple warnings from people who understood the situation better than she did. And in the end, she learned the same lesson that every would-be tyrant eventually learns. There are some things bigger than your little kingdom, some laws more important than your rules, some principles worth standing up for no matter the cost. My tower stands on my property now, taller and stronger than before, ready to serve when the next disaster strikes. And when that storm comes, as it inevitably will, I'll be there at my radio, coordinating, communicating, connecting people when they need it most. Because that's what amateur radio operators do. We serve, we prepare, we stand ready, and no HOA in the world can take that away from us. Sarah and I settled into our new life with a sense of relief that surprised both of us. We hadn't realized just how much stress we'd been under living in Meadowbrook Hills until we were finally out of there. Our new neighbors were scattered across large properties, people who'd specifically chosen to live away from HOAs and suburban rules. They were welcoming without being intrusive, friendly without being nosy. The new tower was a thing of beauty. Without HOA restrictions, I was able to build it to proper specifications, with better grounding, better antenna arrays, and better access for maintenance. The coverage area was significantly larger than my old setup, and the signal quality was excellent. I'd been working with the County Emergency Management Office to get my new station officially designated as a backup emergency communications center. The paperwork was moving through channels, but Tom Mitchell had already given me an unofficial thumbs up. "We need more sites like yours," he told me during an inspection visit. "Distributed infrastructure is critical when major systems go down. What happened last year with the Hendricks situation really opened people's eyes around here about the value of amateur radio." That was one unexpected positive outcome from the whole mess. The incident had raised awareness about emergency communications and the role of amateur radio. Several other hams in the region had reported that their local governments were suddenly much more interested in working with them to develop emergency communication plans. The American Radio Relay League even did a case study on the incident for their emergency communications training materials. I got invited to speak at conferences about dealing with HOA conflicts and protecting amateur radio installations. I always told the same story. Document everything, know your rights, try to educate rather than antagonize, but be prepared to stand firm when public safety is at stake. 6 months after we moved, I got a call from someone I didn't expect to hear from. Reggie Thompson, the crane operator. "Mr. Ortega, I hope you don't mind me calling. I got your number from the phone book." "Not at all, Reggie. How are you doing?" Good. Listen, I wanted to thank you for warning me that night. If I'd gone through with taking down that tower, I'd be in prison right now instead of Mrs. Hendricks." "You made the right call," I said. "I did, but only because you made sure I understood what was really happening. Mrs. Hendricks lied to me. She told me she had legal authorization. If you hadn't showed up when you did, I would have trusted her." He paused, then continued. "Anyway, I've been thinking about that night a lot, about emergency communications and how important it is. I've actually been studying for my amateur radio license. I figured if I'm going to operate heavy equipment, I should also know how to communicate during emergencies." That made me smile. "That's great, Reggie. Have you taken the test yet?" "Taking it next week. I've been studying hard. Some of this stuff is tricky, but I'm getting it. Let me know when you pass. I'd be happy to help you set up your first station." "I'd appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Ortega." Reggie passed his test and got his license. I helped him set up a mobile rig in his crane and a base station at his house. He became an active member of the local amateur radio club and participated in several emergency drills. It turned out that having a crane operator who was also a ham radio operator was incredibly useful during emergencies. Reggie could get antennas up in places no one else could reach, and he understood both the technical and practical aspects of emergency communications. The irony wasn't lost on me. The guy Patricia had hired to tear down my tower had ended up becoming part of the emergency communications network because of that night. Meanwhile, life in Meadowbrook Hills continued without me. I heard updates occasionally through people I'd stayed in touch with. The HOA had elected a new board that was much more reasonable. They'd created a technical committee to review requests for antennas and other equipment with members who actually understood engineering and federal regulations. Several other residents had put up amateur radio antennas after my departure. The HOA approved them all without incident. One guy even put up a tower bigger than mine had been. Mrs. Chen sent me a Christmas card that first year with a note. "Meadowbrook Hills isn't the same without you, but I'm glad you're somewhere that appreciates what you do." The following hurricane season was relatively quiet, just a couple of tropical storms that caused minor damage. But when tornado warnings were issued in the spring, my station was activated as part of the severe weather net. We tracked the storms, relayed spotter reports, and helped coordinate emergency responses in several counties. One tornado touched down near an elementary school just as classes were letting out. The cell network was overwhelmed with everyone trying to call and check on their kids, but the amateur radio network was able to coordinate with the school administration and the emergency services to get real-time updates about the situation. All the kids were fine. They'd taken shelter in the school's storm shelter and rode out the tornado safely, but their parents didn't know that until we were able to pass messages through the radio network. That night, I got calls from about a dozen grateful parents who'd heard about the amateur radio assistance. One of them was a reporter for the local newspaper. She did a feature story about amateur radio and emergency communications, with a focus on how prepared volunteers with the right equipment could save lives. The story mentioned the Hendricks case as an example of why it was so important to protect emergency communications infrastructure from interference. It painted Patricia as a cautionary tale of what happens when personal agendas conflict with public safety. I felt a twinge of guilt about that. Patricia had served her time. She'd paid her fines. She'd lost her community standing and her reputation. The story was bringing it all back up again. But Sarah pointed out something I needed to hear. That story might prevent another HOA somewhere from doing the same thing. If Patricia's mistake keeps other amateur radio operators from being harassed, then maybe something good came out of it. She was right, of course. The case had become a landmark example in HOA and telecommunications law. Several states had actually passed new legislation clarifying that HOAs could not prohibit amateur radio antennas used for emergency communications. Federal courts had cited the Hendricks case in rulings protecting amateur radio installations. Patricia's personal tragedy had created legal protections that would benefit amateur radio operators for decades to come. 2 years after the original incident, I was invited to testify before a congressional subcommittee that was considering amendments to the Federal Telecommunications Act. They wanted to strengthen protections for emergency communications infrastructure and close some loopholes that HOAs and local governments had been exploiting. I flew to Washington, D.C. and spent 3 hours answering questions from committee members about amateur radio, emergency communications, and the practical challenges operators faced. One congressman asked me directly, "Mr. Ortega, do you think the penalties in the Hendricks case were appropriate?" I thought carefully before answering. I think the judge made the right decision, given the seriousness of what happened. Mrs. Hendricks attempted to disable critical emergency infrastructure during a major disaster. If she'd succeeded, people could have died. That said, I think the real problem wasn't the severity of the penalties, but the fact that it had to get to that point at all. What do you mean? I mean that we need better education about amateur radio and emergency communications. Most people have no idea what amateur radio is or why it matters. HOA board members often don't understand the federal regulations they're supposed to comply with. If we had better outreach and education, situations like mine could be avoided entirely. The committee seemed to take that to heart. The final bill they passed included not just stronger protections for emergency communications infrastructure, but also funding for public education programs about amateur radio and requirements for HOA training on federal telecommunications law. The bill was nicknamed the Emergency Communications Protection Act, but people in the amateur radio community started calling it the Hendricks Law. I got a lot of credit for that legislation, but honestly, all I'd done was try to protect my ability to serve my community. I never set out to change federal law or become some kind of amateur radio advocate. I just wanted to keep my tower up and do my job. But sometimes, standing up for what's right in your own small corner of the world ends up having ripple effects you never anticipated. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm over the next few years. I continued my emergency communications work. Sarah got involved in local community theater. We made new friends in our rural area who appreciated our quirks rather than trying to regulate them. I upgraded my equipment several times, always staying current with the latest technology. The tower grew taller as I added new antennas for different bands and modes. My ham shack evolved into a sophisticated communication center that could operate completely off-grid with solar power and battery backup. During a major ice storm that knocked out power across the region for 2 weeks, my station became a lifeline. I ran phone patches for people who needed to contact family members. I coordinated supply deliveries to people who were stranded. I relayed medical information between patients and doctors who couldn't reach each other any other way. The county emergency management director showed up at my house on the 3rd day of the outage with a satellite internet terminal and a request that I coordinate all communications for the western half of the county until power was restored. I did it, running round-the-clock shifts with help from other local hams. When the crisis was over, the county commission officially designated my station as an emergency communications center and gave me an annual stipend to help cover equipment and maintenance costs. It wasn't much money, but the official recognition meant a lot. I thought about Patricia sometimes, wondering how she was doing, whether she'd managed to rebuild her life after federal prison. I never reached out, figuring she probably didn't want to hear from me, but I hoped she was okay. Then, about 4 years after the original incident, I got an email that surprised me. It was from Patricia. "Dear Mr. Ortega," it began. "I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from. I also know that no apology I offer can undo the harm I caused or the stress I put you and your family through. But I wanted you to know that I've spent the past 4 years thinking about what happened and why. Prison was the worst experience of my life, but it also forced me to confront some hard truths about myself. I was so obsessed with control, with being right, with asserting my authority, that I lost sight of what really mattered. I put my own ego ahead of people's safety. That's unforgivable. I've been seeing a therapist since I got out. She's helped me understand that my need to control everything came from deep insecurity and fear. I use the HOA presidency as a way to feel important and powerful, and when you challenge that, I felt threatened. None of that excuses what I did, but I want you to know that I understand now why what I did was wrong. Not just legally wrong, but morally wrong. You were trying to help people, and I tried to stop you because of my own petty concerns about property values and community aesthetics. I've actually been volunteering with a disaster relief organization here in Florida. I can't operate radios or anything technical, but I help coordinate supplies and support services. It's my way of trying to give back and make amends for the harm I caused. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even know if I deserve forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that I'm sorry, truly and deeply sorry, for everything. Patricia Hendricks. I read the email 3 times, trying to figure out how I felt about it. There was a part of me that was still angry at her, still resentful about everything she'd put me through. But there was also a part of me that felt relieved that she seemed to have learned something from the experience. I showed the email to Sarah. "What do you think?" She read it carefully. "I think it sounds genuine, and I think it took courage to write it." "Should I respond?" "That's up to you, but I think she's genuinely trying to make amends." I thought about it for a few days, then wrote back. "Patricia, thank you for your email. I appreciate the apology and the reflection you've done. What happened 4 years ago was difficult for everyone involved, but I'm glad to hear that you found a way to move forward positively. I don't harbor any ill will toward you. I never wanted you to go to prison or face such severe consequences. I just wanted to protect the emergency communications infrastructure that serves our community. I'm glad you found meaningful work in disaster relief. That kind of service is valuable and important. I wish you well in your continued recovery and growth." Todd Ortega. We exchanged a few more emails over the following months. Patricia told me about her work in Florida, about the therapy that had helped her, about the relationships she was rebuilding with her family. I told her about my continued emergency communications work and the new protections for amateur radio that had come out of our case. It was strange, developing a kind of friendly correspondence with someone who'd tried to tear down my tower and ended up in federal prison because of it. But it also felt like closure, like we were both finally able to move past that awful night during the hurricane. The amateur radio community continued to grow and evolve. New technologies emerged that made emergency communications even more effective. Digital modes allowed for more efficient use of limited spectrum. Satellite connections provided backup paths when terrestrial infrastructure failed, but the fundamental mission remained the same. Be ready when disaster strikes, keep the lines of communication open, serve the community. I trained dozens of new amateur radio operators over the years, always emphasizing the importance of emergency preparedness and public service. Several of them went on to become emergency coordinators for their own districts. Reggie Thompson, the crane operator, became one of my success stories. He got his advanced amateur radio license and became the technical coordinator for our regional emergency communications network. His unique combination of crane operating skills and radio expertise made him invaluable during infrastructure disasters. Mrs. Chen's son, the firefighter, also got his amateur radio license. He convinced his fire department to install radios in all their trucks and to train firefighters in basic radio operations. When the department's regular communication system failed during a warehouse fire, the amateur radio network filled the gaps seamlessly. Small victories, each one making the community a little safer, a little more resilient. The Meadowbrook Hills HOA eventually reached out to me with an unusual request. They wanted to install a community emergency communication center and asked if I would consult on the design. They even offered to name it after me. I declined the naming honor, but I did help with the design. They built a small building near the community center, equipped it with proper radio equipment, and trained several residents to operate it. It became part of the regional emergency communications network. The irony was rich. The same HOA that had tried to tear down my tower because it was an eyesore now had a bigger, more visible communications installation right in the heart of their community. But times had changed, and so had people's understanding of emergency preparedness. I visited Meadowbrook Hills for the dedication ceremony. It was strange being back after so many years. Some of the residents who'd been hostile to me had moved away. Others apologized for how they'd treated me. A few seemed to have conveniently forgotten that they'd ever been part of the problem. Jeremy Blackstone, the former treasurer, shook my hand warmly. "We should have listened to you from the start. You were right about everything." "It's not about being right," I said. "It's about being prepared." The new HOA president, a retired engineer named Frank Morrison, gave a speech at the dedication ceremony. "This communication center represents our commitment to public safety and community resilience. It also represents a lesson learned. We learned that property values and aesthetic concerns, while important, must never take precedence over public safety. We learned that federal protections exist for good reasons. And we learned that sometimes the most valuable community assets are the ones that serve us when we need them most, even if they're not the prettiest to look at." It was a good speech, and I appreciated the sentiment, but I couldn't help thinking about how much pain and trouble could have been avoided if people had understood those lessons from the beginning. After the ceremony, Mrs. Chen cornered me with a container of her amazing soup. "I've been making this for every important occasion since you left. It's my way of honoring what you did for us." "You really don't need to do that," I said, but I took the soup gratefully. It was delicious, as always. "Yes, I do," she said firmly. "You stood up for what was right when everyone else was against you. You saved lives. That deserves soup." I laughed. It was the first time I'd genuinely laughed about anything related to Meadowbrook Hills in years. Driving home that evening, Sarah and I talked about how surreal the whole experience had been. From the hostile confrontation during the hurricane to federal charges to prison time to public vindication to community reconciliation. It had been a journey neither of us could have anticipated. "Do you ever regret how it all played out?" Sarah asked. I thought about it. "I regret that Patricia went to prison. I regret that the community had to pay such high fines. I regret the stress and the vandalism and the ugly parts of it. But do I regret standing up for the tower and for emergency communications? No. That was the right thing to do. And I'd do it again. Even knowing how it would turn out. Some things are worth fighting for, even when the fight gets ugly." The years continued to pass. My hair went gray, then white. I started wearing reading glasses to see the small print on my radio equipment. But my passion for amateur radio and emergency communications never faded. I was there for every hurricane, every tornado, every ice storm, every flood. I coordinated communications, relayed messages, helped connect people when the normal systems failed. It's what I'd signed up for decades ago when I first got my amateur radio license, and it's what I continued to do. The tower that Patricia Hendricks had tried to tear down that stormy night so many years ago had been replaced by an even better one. But the mission remained the same. Be ready, stay connected, serve the community. And when the next storm came, as storms always do, I was there at my radio, doing what I'd always done, communicating, coordinating, connecting, because some things are more important than property values, or HOA rules, or personal conflicts. Some things transcend the petty concerns of daily life. Community. Service, preparedness, connection. These are the values that matter when disaster strikes, when the normal systems fail, when people need help. And these are the values that a stubborn amateur radio operator in North Carolina chose to defend, one stormy night in the face of an HOA president who didn't understand what was really at stake. The tower still stands, the radios still work, the mission continues. And that's what really matters in the end.